Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this corporate services meeting. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge this meeting is taking place on the traditional territories of our Coast Salish First Nations. I'd also like to welcome alternate directors Tatum and Jonas today. Good to see you. So with that, we'll need an approval of the agenda if there's no additions. Mr. Secretary, anything new?
No new business.
I've seen a hand over here. Director Jackson. Oh, moved and seconded. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary.
And before you, the adoption of the minutes of the Corporate Services Committee meeting of April 11th.
Moved by Director Davis, second by Director Stone. No discussion. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Next is public input period, and I think I can handle that on my own. I don't see any public out there.
You want me to step up there and make it something?
Not you. Not you.
I haven't talked much today, so maybe you put your hand up.
Mr. Secretary, can you move us along?
Staff reports from the General Manager of Corporate Services regarding the 2017 financial statements and audit results. And while there's a recommendation, Mr. Keeber will speak first.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm here actually to introduce some staff. Tracy Bowen, who's looking after things while the rest of the finance staff are away. And Christine Simpson, who's here from BDO, who will be able to answer any questions. And she's going to actually give a short presentation of the financial statements from the auditor's perspective. And then both or either can answer whatever question you may have at the end. So, Christine.
Thank you. As I understand it, there was a memo in your package that went through the financial statement changes. I think you've seen that already. My intention was to walk through the audit process and what we did as auditors, which is attachment C in your package. Should I give you a moment to find that? It's got a nice pretty picture on the front. Let me know when everybody's ready. Okay, sure. Okay, so do you want it on the screen?
Did you want to have it on the screen?
It's up to you.
Can we do that?
I'm happy to do it either way. I have it on my screen in front of me, but
Let's put it on the walls, if we can.
sorry, it's in the package, so I. I'm happy to run it if you want it.
It's just that way we can watch you while you talk instead of
I'll move it along. Sure.
staring down.
That's a good thing. The package. That's right.
Oh, okay. Interactive. Okay. Number C. Okay. I haven't had any training in this particular.
Perfect. Just arrows? Everybody can see that? Okay. Find the page up, page down. Can everybody hear me okay? So first off, I'll just walk through. Are we good? we good? In terms of status, I just want to help you understand that we do an audit in accordance with public sector accounting standards, and we follow generally accepted auditing standards. The point we're at today, we're substantially complete our audit. Part of the final procedures we need to do is get the board approval of the statements, subject to the discussion we're going to have today. And we're also required to do some subsequent events procedures. Essentially, we want to make sure that nothing's happened since we last did our audit field work, confirm with management that nothing's changed and nothing else has to be added to the statements. So that will be a final procedure, as well as we'll get a representation letter from management confirming that they gave us access to everything we needed to do our audit efficiently. I will then walk through a few of the areas in the audit where we spent a little bit of additional time. In terms of specific areas that we spend time on, the key here is that my team, we have 3 partners and 6 managers, we all work on public sector audits and not-for-profit audits. So we have a very good understanding of where things could go wrong, and therefore we use judgment to put more time into certain areas of the audit where we think there's a risk of potential error, either intentional or unintentional, or just complicated accounting areas. The first item I'll mention, though, is a mandatory area. Public sector auditing standards require us to spend some time to make sure that management hasn't made purposeful overrides of internal controls. So we do look at manual journal entries at the end of the year to ensure that they're appropriate, they follow business purposes, and they're not made purely to adjust to meet budgets or other indicators that you're trying to meet. So we do that. There's no issues to bring to your attention there. On the following page, in terms of cash and investments, we do spend time ensuring, sorry, I'm just going to make sure I lose that. We look at confirmations from banks and investment companies to make sure all the cash exists and is there and presented properly. Staff salaries, given it's a very significant dollar figure, we do spend quite a bit of time on ensuring there's controls around adding staff, changing payroll rates, and accounting for all the employee future benefits and any unpaid amounts at year end, such as vacation or sick leaves. The next item on that page, tangible capital assets, obviously there's a lot of activity here. So we're looking at anything new that's added, anything that's been disposed of during the year because it's the end of the life, or because you've had a new project where something had to be pulled out early to accommodate for something. I.e. you put in changed up some water systems and some other things had to be removed earlier than expected. So we do look at those, as well as we look at anything that's contributed, making sure that often if there's a non-cash transaction, we want to make sure that that gets picked up properly. Government grants, I would say that this is probably the most complicated, and recognition of revenue in general is the most complicated area. Every grant agreement will be different in terms of what the funder expects. When you receive the cash, sometimes you get the cash up front, sometimes you have to claim for it after you've spent the money. So we do spend a fair bit of time looking at those different grant agreements to make sure we understand the requirements, where the money can be spent, whether any surpluses can be retained or have to be returned, and when revenue can be recognized. Often the cash is received in one period and spent in a different period, so we're making sure revenue is being recognized in the correct period. The next item on this page, landfill closure and post-closure liabilities, a very complicated area. I believe it was 2 years ago we made a provision because for the closure costs for the Mead Creek site, in the projected budget for that project, there was both costs to remediate the site, but as also to build the recycling depot. So the costs for cleanup were accrued a couple of years ago. During the current year, a portion of the cleanup was done and the construction was started. So there was a slight error in the calculations. It's very complicated. It was around $600,000, which was not adjusted at year end. We found it at the very last minute, so we left it unadjusted. You'll see that in a minute, but we didn't think it was material enough to adjust it at the last minute. Contaminated sites. There have been several sites of potential contamination. Management's gone through and done reviews and determined that they don't believe they're liable for any of these sites, and therefore no provisions have been made, and we concur with management's assessment of that. And contingencies as well, we always spend some time ensuring we look at legal invoices. Sorry, I don't know how I manage that. legal invoices, as well as we get confirmations from lawyers to make sure that there's nothing that should be accrued and or disclosed in the financial statements, and we have nothing to report to you. With respect to fraud, I will just remind everybody that the primary purpose of the audit is to ensure that the financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects. It is not a fraud-focused audit. So we do a minimal amount of procedures around looking for fraud, but that's not our primary focus during the audit. So just a reminder there. I do have a duty to report to you if there's any fraud that I uncover, and I have nothing to report to you. And vice versa, if there is anything that you are aware of or comes to your attention that you're concerned of, you do have a responsibility to inform the auditors before we sign off. And in the future years, just something to remind you that you have a duty to report to us. And that's why we have these discussions, so you have a chance to report anything. Similarly, internal controls. As auditors, we make decisions on the most efficient and effective way to audit, and sometimes that will be a review of internal controls, and sometimes that will be substantively looking at transactions. So we make that assessment and judgment. So what I'm reminding you here is that we do not look at every single internal control. We look at those where we think it's the most effective way to do the audit. You may, in other circumstances, have dealt with an internal control review where we do look at all internal controls, but in a financial statement audit, we choose which controls to review, which we believe are necessary to sign off on the financial statement audit. We have not noted any significant deficiencies in internal controls, but as a value add to the audit, if there's any areas where we think there could be improvements or inefficiencies or controls, we do make some recommendations, which I'll get to in a moment. The required communications just reminds you that you have a duty for oversight directly to the audit. By having this report here, I have covered off all the topics that you're required to be responsible for signing off on the audit. Appendix A is a copy of our draft audit opinion that will be signed. I will remind you that management is responsible for the preparation of the financial statements and the disclosures in the notes and choosing the accounting policies. As an auditor, I really only own that one page that says that I believe that they're presented fairly in all material respects. Appendix B is a summary of any adjustments that were made during the audit and or unadjusted. So what you'll see here is a very nice thing that there were no audit adjustments. So there's nothing that my team came up with that we came back to management and said needs to be adjusted, except for that one item that I mentioned earlier, around $600,000. And I really have to say it's a very complicated accounting issue that wasn't picked up, and it was picked up late in the game, and I think it would have been adjusted if I'd picked it up earlier. So I'm not concerned about it being material to the statement, so we'll just adjust this next year when we go forward. Appendix C is a representation letter. This is the letter I mentioned that management will sign. It basically confirms that they've given us all the documents, they've disclosed any information to us that they think is important to the audit, given us free access to all the staff we need to speak to, and access to yourselves to have this discussion. And Appendix D is the management letter. As I mentioned, these are areas where we make suggestions on improvements to processes, either for efficiency or internal control. First off, I'll highlight some of the items we brought up last year, just so you can see whether they were resolved or not. There have been several potentially contaminated sites in the past. We did recommend that the district do an assessment to determine if there's any liabilities, and those assessments have been completed during 2017. The second item there, bid and tender contracts. Last year we happened to look for one tender document. We weren't able to locate it, so management has improved a policy to ensure that all those are kept in the proper places, so that documentation's in place. So that's been dealt with this year. Similarly, payroll reconciliations last year, there were some delays in those being reviewed and signed off. We're happy to note that that's been dealt with this year. There's a few items we highlighted this year. The first one being the district did what I'll call a system conversion from Class to Legend, which is a recreational system. It did not go as well as planned. So essentially, as with any IT project, we do recommend a little bit more due diligence prior to the conversion to make sure it's ready and working properly so that you don't run into problems and have to back off of it. So management says that they will take that into consideration with any future IT projects. Interest capitalization, I just noted that there wasn't a policy as to whether interest will be capitalized or not on major projects. At this time, there's nothing to be concerned about, but it's just something to put in place. As you're assessing future projects, you want to understand whether there's an interest component in those projects or not. And the third one is really just a reminder, those of you who may not be aware, and it was in the news yesterday, there is a new employer health tax, and it will be a significant cost for those with large salaries like yourself, and I just want to make sure that everybody's incorporating that into their budgets going forward. Yeah. Yes, so it will flow through, and it will be a net cost to the district, so it's just a reminder. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has on the audit process.
Director Stone,
I'll move the recommendation.
seconded by Director Lefebvre. Any more discussion? Director Davis.
Thank you. I just had a question about the employer health tax, and
For the public sector auditor? Go ahead.
I guess it's for
I'm
our
teasing.
staff, but was this listed under risks or just
It's
something
just,
to be aware of?
just something to be aware of in budgeting and cost of the, yeah.
I guess are we likely to have a report on that at some time in the near future from our staff?
Mr. Crothers, can you repeat the question?
Are we going to have a report on how the employer health tax will be affecting us? I'm guessing that it was because our two senior finance staff left around the time that we didn't get into the UBCM report.
Mr. Keeper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So at this point, it's actually in with payroll or in HR. HR is actually in the process of reviewing that, and as Christine said, it's brand new. It just came out, so we were anticipating something, but we weren't too sure more of the details. So right now, HR will be reviewing that and bringing a report back, just letting the board know. Not only the board, but also the staff as they prepare the budgets for next year.
Thank you very much. Director Morrison.
Thank you. And in the question of recommended further due diligence,
Sorry, which point?
recommended further due diligence on the conversion of the softwares. It was recommended that staff and that they would. Can you give me some ideas to the nature of how you can further investigate and prevent the type of issue that happened there? Because I recall when the recommendations came forward that from staff's assessment and from the best assessment of this board, it appeared to be the best product moving forward that we could get at the time, and it obviously wasn't. So what would be the nature of the type of due diligence that our staff would undertake for something like that?
I will do my best to answer this question. First, because I didn't get into the details, to tell you the truth. But I could tell you that in the marketplace, I'm hearing problems with these systems as a whole. So I don't think it was necessarily a staff issue, that the software, I think a lot of people are having challenges with that. But my understanding is that the software worked, but the reporting wasn't doing what you wanted it to do. So it was more that it was a surprise that it wasn't doing that. So I'm not sure if the testing went as far as maybe it should have. Just so that I think you can work with any software, but you want to make sure that you're not surprised by the results or the reporting that you're going to get from it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Director Lefebvre, did I see your hand up? Okay. No, apparently not. All those in favor of the recommendation then? All those opposed? Seeing none, motion carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we can move us along to question period. And thank you very much, Christine.
No problem.
Is there any, yes, Director Stone? Any members? Thank you, Mr. Stone, but I'll chair the meeting from over here. So any questions from the public? We have one member concerning items on this agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. I have one quick question to do with the employer health tax. Is there a rate that we're aware of, percentage rate, or is that determined in some different fashions? Is it a set rate? Does anybody know, or is it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Okay. We don't know yet what the outcome of the tax will be. So we can move along to adjournment, I guess. Moved by Director Marcotte, second by Director Jackson. All those in favor, opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you very much.